Hello, my holy sisters and brothers. I am tuning in to teach our AT Daily class from Jerusalem once again. I don't have my usual equipment, and so we'll just wait a couple of minutes for people to find the show. Let me do this here. Okay, here we go. Okay, very good. We are live. Just wait the usual 2 minutes. And let us know where you're tuning in from. Right? Put it in the comments since it's not on this screen. Where are you tuning in from? Okay. Shandora in the Bronx. Welcome, Shandora. Hopefully you guys can hear me and see me well enough. It's not the usual lighting, not the usual camera, not the usual gear, but we do what we can. Okay, and then we will update the schedule momentarily. Just give it another minute before we start. Okay. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam shah kol v'ro. Okay. Hopefully Nina is able to do it and to share it to the groups. As usual, I think we're not able to send out the notification on the AT app. Again, I didn't expect to be here in Jerusalem this long. Came here for the premieres of Guns N' Moses and then was blessed to stay here longer than anticipated. The war goes on. And no war is pleasant, but this one was necessary, and thank God it's going incredibly well. That the snake has been beheaded. We pray that the Persian people will rise up and take their country back from the evil regime that colonized it. And thank God. I mean, there's so much of the weaponry and the machine of terrorism and harm that Iran had, that the regime that took over Iran has been removed from them. And please God, the world should be a safer place. But as I said, I didn't expect to be here this long. The good news is, and we'll confirm this tomorrow. I won't believe it until it's actually happened. But I should be flying home tomorrow. So definitely check the Facebook page, Accidental Talmudist, tomorrow. If all goes as planned, I have a ticket. Things could change. We're in a war. But as scheduled for now, I have a ticket tomorrow. So we won't have a class tomorrow, Monday, but God willing, we'll be back at the regular time, 6 p.m. Pacific, on Tuesday and Wednesday. So check the Facebook page for that. I'll mention this again at the end of class. Check the Facebook page. But we should be back to our usual schedule on Tuesday and Wednesday if indeed I fly home tomorrow. That I do have the ticket. I have a seat. I've been told by Ella, like I said, I'll believe it when I'm at the airport and I'm at the gate. But assuming that holds, then we'll put it on the Facebook page. And if that holds, there won't be class tomorrow, Monday. But we should be back to our normal schedule if I'm back in America for Tuesday and Wednesday. Check the Facebook page for that. Okay, who's in the house? Lynn in Canada. Lynn in Canada. Melissa in Great Neck. Lynn says, I did get the notification from the ATF and from Facebook. Woohoo! All right, that's excellent. Very good. Well done, Nina. Melinda in Florida. Janice says, Amen. Sue Strauss in the house from Chicago. All right, let's get to it. Our daf tonight is page 48 here in Tractate Menachot, the 30th volume of the Talmud, continuing our discussion of Mishna number 4 here in chapter 4. Mishna number 4, generally speaking, we're talking about what happens with the 2 lambs and the 2 loaves of Shavuos. If one of them gets disqualified, what do you do with the others? That's the basic question. Okay, we're picking this up pretty close to the top of page 48a, maybe a quarter of the way down. Okay, so Rav Acha, the son of Rava, said to Rav Ashi, let us say that the Baraisa, which states that if the sheep of Shavuos are slaughtered with 4 loaves instead of 2, right? It's supposed to be 2 sheep and 2 loaves. Okay, so last time we talked about at the end of last class, what if there were 4 loaves, and then what's going to become of the extra loaves, right? So let us say that the Baraisa, which states that if the sheep of Shavuos are slaughtered with 4 loaves instead of 2, so 2 of the 4 loaves are invested with inherent sanctity. They become consecrated as the loaves of Shavuos, which are going to be eaten by the priests, and this is all when the temple is standing in Jerusalem, which it hasn't in nearly 2,000 years, but when it is, then 2 of those loaves would be invested with inherent sanctity, and those are the ones that the priests eat, and then the nation is permitted to eat wheat from the new crop of that year. And that this holding is a conclusive refutation of the opinion of Rabbi Yochanan that was stated with regard to a thanks offering. It's a particular kind of offering called a todah, the thanks offering, which normally is accompanied by 40 loaves, 10 loaves of each of 4 kinds. So 40 loaves are normally accompanying a thanks offering. But what if it was accompanied by 80 loaves? So same idea, doubling the number of loaves that are required for that offering. So Rabbi Yochanan stated with regard to a thanks offering that one slaughtered accompanied by 80 loaves rather than the required 40. In that case, Chizkiah says 40 of the 80 loaves are consecrated, and Rabbi Yochanan says not even 40 of the 80 loaves are consecrated. In other words, having extra is not a positive, it's a negative because you don't know which loaves are properly sanctified, and then according to Rabbi Yochanan, none of them are sanctified. The Gemara answers, wasn't it stated with regard to this dispute that Rabbi Zera says everyone, even Rabbi Yochanan, concedes that in a case where the individual bringing the offering said, let 40 of the 80 loaves be consecrated, then 40 are consecrated. So here too, one can say that the Baraisa is referring to a case where one said, let 2 of the 4 loaves be consecrated, and then they are. The problem would be if he brought 4 loaves and he didn't say anything about them, then there's this ambiguity that might be a fatal ambiguity in terms of disqualifying those loaves. And we're learning out, if somebody brought 80 instead of 40 along with the thanks offering, again, would create that same kind of ambiguity. But if he at least stated, let 40 of these 80 be consecrated, then we could work with that. Okay, next topic. The Gemara cites another discussion concerning the sheep and the loaves of Shavuos. Right? So before we talked about what if there's 4 loaves instead of 2, now we're going to do the opposite idea. Rabbi Chanina Tirata taught a Baraisa before Rabbi Yochanan. If one slaughtered 4 sheep for Shavuos rather than the required 2, and it was accompanied by 2 loaves. What should he do? Right? He slaughtered 4 animals, 4 sheep, where he should have slaughtered 2. Right? So now there's a problem because we have 2 extra animal offerings in the temple that were slaughtered inappropriately. So what's going to happen? In that situation, right, says Rabbi Chanina to Rata in a baraisa that he brought before Rabbi Yochanan, he says, so the priest should draw 2 of the sheep out of the 4 and sprinkle their blood not for the sake of the sheep of Shavuos, right? What's he sprinkling the blood for? Presumably some other peace offering, some other offering of lesser sanctity, but not the sheep of Shavuos. And he then, after sprinkling the blood of those 2, extra sheep, not for the sake of Shavuos, then the remaining 2 sheep, these are going to be the sheep of Shavuos. And now that they're already slaughtered, he's going to sprinkle their blood on the altar for the sake of the correct offering, the sheep of Shavuos. Why would he do that? As if you do not do this, but rather require him to sprinkle on the altar the blood of the first 2 sheep, of these 4 that he slaughtered, then you have caused the loss of the latter 2 sheep. He slaughtered 4. He should have only slaughtered 2, but he slaughtered 4. If you take the first 2 and slaughter their blood and sprinkle their blood on the altar, then the other 2 that are remaining, nothing can be done with them. But if you take the first 2 and just sprinkle their blood as some other kind of peace offering, then the remaining 2 can be slaughtered as the sheep of Shavuos. If you reverse that order, the first 2 become Shavuos, the other 2 are rendered unfit, and you can't do anything with them. You're going to have to just burn the flesh of those animals. The priest can't eat it. It's not going to go up on the altar. It's all bad. Right, explains Rav Steinsaltz, since they were previously fit to have their blood sprinkled on the altar for the sake of the sheep of Shavuos, and then they were disqualified from this status when the blood of the first 2 sheep was sprinkled for that purpose, then those remaining 2 sheep would no longer be fit to have their blood sprinkled, even for the sake of a different offering. That's why it's better to take the first 2, sprinkle for a different purpose, and then the remaining 2 for Shavuos. Rabbi Yochanan said to Rabbi Chanina to Rata, and does the court say to a person, arise and sin in order that you may gain? Right? These 4 sheep were slaughtered with the idea that they would be for Shavuos. If you now take the first 2 and slaughter them for some other reason so that you can preserve the 4 that should be slaughtered for some purpose, it's like you redesignated something that you weren't supposed to redesignate, the first 2 sheep, sprinkling them for something else, in order that you don't end up, wasting 2 of the 4 sheep. So in a sense, it's committing a sin with the redesignation of the first 2 sheep in order not to have a loss. So is this a principle that we're going to allow? Sinning for the purpose of gain. I mean, this is not like, stealing from something from the store so that you get, money profiting from theft. But, being very, very careful and stringent with the laws of sacrifices, in a sense, it's like a sin for the purpose of gain. And that's what they're asking. Do we say this? But didn't we learn in a Mishna, Tractate Zevachim, or previous tractate, 77a, that the Tanaim, the sages of the Mishnah, disagree concerning this very matter. The Mishnah teaches, in the case of the limbs of a sin offering, whose flesh is eaten by priests, and therefore may not be burned on the altar, but they became intermingled with the limbs of a burnt offering, which are burned on the altar. In that situation, Rabbi Eliezer says, the priest shall place all the limbs above on the altar, and I view the flesh of the limbs of the sin offering that are now on the altar as though they were pieces of wood that are just burning there as fuel for the parts of the animals that should be on the altar. But this was a minority opinion, and the rabbis say, no. When the limbs of a sin offering that are going to be eaten by the priest, a mistake is made and they get intermingled with the limbs of a burnt offering that are destined to go up on the altar, this intermingling disqualifies all of it. right? Both the limbs of the sin offering and the limbs of the burnt offering, now that they're intermingled, they're all disqualified. And so the rabbis, meaning the majority who overrule Rabbi Eliezer, say one should wait until the form of all the intermingled limbs decays, and they will go out to the place of burning in the temple courtyard, where all disqualified offerings of the most sacred order are burned. Meaning, they're not going to be able to go up on the altar. You're not going to just take them to the place where disqualified offerings are burned because they're disqualified, because they're not yet disqualified. It's just that we have no solution to this problem of intermingling. So what you do basically is you wait beyond their time, beyond the time that they would be fit. Now, like any other offerings that waited too long before being eaten or burned, they can no longer go up on the altar nor be eaten by the priest, and they go to this place of burning, right? The place of burning for disqualified offerings. This is where they need to go. Right? So Rabbi Yochanan explains, according to your opinion, why do the rabbis say that the mixture is burned? Instead, let the court say to the priest, arise and sin by burning all the limbs on the altar, including the limbs of the sin offering, in order that you may gain by performing the mitzvah of sacrificing the limbs of a burnt offering. Okay, they're intermingled, so you don't know which ones are edible by priests and which ones are destined to, because they became intermingled, which ones should be burned on the altar. So burn them all on the altar. Right? And at least we all benefit in that an animal wasn't wasted. It was used as a burnt offering. So since the majority didn't say that, it must be that in the case of these two extra sheep of the, that were slaughtered for the Shavuos offering, they shouldn't be used as a peace offering either. They should just be disqualified and end up in the place of burning. And you take the first two sheep of the four, you shouldn't have slaughtered four, but you did. So the first two become the Shavuos offering, the other two just go to the place of burning rather than the altar. Rabbi Hanina Terata answered this challenge from Rabbi Yochanan by saying, we do say, arise and sin with a sin offering in order that you may gain with regard to a sin offering, since it is the same type of offering. And similarly, one may sin with regard to the sheep of Shavuos in order to gain with regard to the other sheep brought for the same offering. In other words, the sheep of Shavuos are technically a peace offering, so you can bring these other two, the extra ones, so to speak, as a peace offering. And that doesn't violate the principle that we established when sin offering limbs became intermingled with burnt offering limbs. And we don't allow that, to all of them go on the altar because that's an intermingling of offering types. Whereas, having these extra two sheep of the Shavuos offering is not going to become a different type of offering. It's not that kind of intermingling. Right, so he says, we do not say arise and sin with a sin offering in order that you may gain with regard to a burnt offering, as I just explained. Okay, so Rabbi Yochanan now comes back at Rabbi Hanina Terata and says, and does the court actually say, arise and sin in order that you may gain in a case where the sin and the gain are with regard to one matter? But isn't it Tana Baraisa concerning a case of the two sheep of Shavuos where one slaughtered them not for their own sake, or where he slaughtered them either before their time, i.e. before Shavuos, or after their time, not on Shavuos, beyond Shavuos, that the blood shall be sprinkled, although it shall be sprinkled for the sake of a peace offering, and the meat shall be eaten. So says Rabbi Yochanan, and if the festival was on Shabbos, one may not sprinkle the blood. The sacrificial portions may not be burned on the altar, and the meat may not be eaten. And this is because the improper slaughter of the sheep disqualified them as communal offerings, which communal offerings will bring on Shabbos. Individual offerings, we don't. But if the priest nevertheless sprinkled the blood of these sheep on Shabbos, the offering is accepted, in that it is permitted to burn its sacrificial portions on the altar in the evening after Shabbos is over, and then the meat may be eaten. Okay, what is Rabbi Yochanan saying? Now he makes his conclusion. But according to your opinion, why is it not permitted to sprinkle the blood on Shabbos? Let the court say, arise and sin by sprinkling the blood of these offerings in order that you may gain by being able to burn their sacrificial portions in the evening and then eat their meat. right? Why don't we say in that situation, well, they're like communal offerings, let them be communal offerings. So even though it's Shabbos, we're going to handle it in this way so that they don't go to waste. And Rabbi Hanina Tarata answered, we do say arise and sin even on Shabbos in order that you may gain on Shabbos. But we do not say arise and sin on Shabbos in order that you may gain on a weekday, meaning eat that meat beyond, right, after Shabbos ends. So the Gemara asks, and is it so with regard to two separate matters, the court does not say that one should sin with regard to one in order to gain with regard to the other, right? They're testing the principle. But didn't we learn in a Mishna tractate, Terumos 8:9, in the case of a barrel of wine, that is terumah. Okay, so that's a barrel of wine that was set aside as a tithe to give to the priest. Let's say that there was 50 barrels of wine. One of them was set aside to be terumah for the priest, right? So that barrel of wine can only now be consumed by a priest and his household. And that barrel has to be in a state of purity. It has to be tahor. And the priest and the people in his household who consume it have to be in a state of personal tahara. They need to be pure, not have come into contact with a source of impurity. And if they did, go through a purification. So they are pure and the barrel is pure when they consume that terumah. Terumah is the first 2% of produce, or in this case wine, that is given to priests. If it becomes tamei, right, then the priests are not going to be able to consume it. But there's also the issue of if terumah becomes intermingled with chulin, right, with non-sacred produce, then the non-sacred produce is not going to be available anymore for people to eat and drink it, regular non-priests, right? So it's a big deal. That would be a big financial loss if somebody's terumah became intermingled with the rest of his produce. So keep that in mind as we look at this case, and then we'll understand why we're discussing it in the context of if offerings are becoming intermingled, what we know is sacred with what is questionably sacred. So, in the case of a barrel of wine that is terumah, and it broke in the upper section of a wine press, and in the lower section of the wine press, there is non-sacred, impure wine. Okay, so now we have two issues that are going to be happening simultaneously. The lower wine press, where the wine is collected, that's like the much larger amount of wine. So this person who's making the wine, he has a big investment in the other 49 barrels, let's say. Now, if wine that is not destined for a priest is tamei, is impure, doesn't matter. We don't, if a person who's not a priest, I'm not a priest. Most of you are not priests, unless you're a Cohen. And during the time that the temple is standing, etc. But so a regular Yisrael, or a Levite for that matter, can consume non-sacred wine, even if it's tamei, even if the person's tamei, not a problem. He cannot consume terumah, because that's only for priests, and he cannot consume chulin, right, non-sacred produce that became intermingled with terumah. That's from the point of view of the non-sacred produce and non-priests. From the point of view of the priests, they can consume terumah. But terumah cannot become tamei. So we don't allow, we have to guard terumah from becoming tamei, because if it becomes tamei, then nobody can consume it. So here we've got a situation where we have pure, right, tahor, terumah, and there's a chance that it's going to run into the lower wine press, become intermingled with non-sacred wine that is tamei, right? So the terumah will render the non-sacred wine undrinkable because terumah has become intermingled with it, and the non-sacred wine that is tamei will render the terumah not drinkable for priests because it's tamei. Right? So it's a bad either way. So what's going to happen? Okay, but didn't we learn in a Mishna in the case of a barrel of wine that is terumah that broke in the upper section of a wine press, And in the lower section of the wine press, there is non-sacred, impure wine. And the wine that is terumah will flow into the lower press and become impure. We know it's going to happen. So can we stop it? Right? Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yehoshua both concede that if one is able to rescue even a quarter lug of the wine that is terumah in a pure vessel so that it retains its ritual purity, he should rescue it, even if in the process the rest of the wine that is terumah will mix with the non-sacred wine. And this will cause the owner financial loss, because the wine that is terumah will become impure, causing the entire mixture to become prohibited for consumption. Right? And the problem is, if in stopping, in capturing some of this terumah wine in a pure vessel, some of the terumah is going to get by you and render all of the wine in the lower wine press intermingled with terumah, and therefore no good for regular Jews to drink it. It's going to be a big financial loss, right? If you just stop it, right? If you simply stop it and don't let any of that wine get down to the lower wine press, but the only instrument that you can use to stop it is a vessel that is tamei, that is impure, you're going to render that terumah impure. And that is also a problem, not as big a financial loss, but causes a spiritual harm, right? Because you're rendering terumah tamei. That's what's at the heart of this issue here. Right? But if not, i.e. if one cannot save any of the wine that is terumah, for example, if one does not have any pure vessels with which to collect it, right? If you can't capture terumah in a pure vessel, a vessel that is free of tumah, then when you catch it in a tamei vessel, you're going to render the terumah tamei. So if you don't have any pure vessels with which to collect it, then Rabbi Eliezer says the terumah wine should be allowed to descend and become impure on its own, ruining the non-sacred wine in the lower press. But one should not render it impure through his direct action. Right? What he's saying is you can't on purpose render terumah tamei. You should not render it impure through his direct action by catching it in an impure vessel, even though catching it would prevent the wine that is terumah from mixing with his impure, non-sacred wine. That's the view of Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Yehoshua says, since the wine that is terumah will become impure in any event, once it goes down and mixes with the lower wine, which is tamei, so one may even render it impure with his direct action in order to save his non-sacred wine. And this indicates that according to Rabbi Yehoshua, it is permitted to sin with regard to one matter, i.e., to make the wine that is terumah tamei, in order to gain with regard to another matter, to save your non-sacred wine from becoming intermingled with terumah. We're on page 48b. It's a little complicated, but you see there's two competing problems, and you have to choose between them. And it's not just, okay, we'll make sure, we avoid the greater loss, because in order to avoid the greater financial loss, you're going to sin by rendering terumah wine tamei. But their point is, Rabbi Yehoshua's point is, well, it was going to become tamei anyway, not with direct action. It was just going to happen. But you can intercede because you're not really changing the outcome, even with your direct action of stopping the terumah wine from flowing down, and in the process rendering it tamei. Okay, so the Gemara responds, it is different there in this case of the wine, because the wine that is terumah is going to become impure in any event. So consequently, his action is not considered a sin, and this is not a case of sinning with regard to one matter in order to gain in another. So we can't use this as a proof to say that when you have these 4 sheep that were slaughtered when it only should have been 2, that therefore, okay, take the first 2 and sprinkle their blood as a peace offering, and only the next 2 as a Shavuos offering. We haven't proven that you can do that in order to save 2 from ending up in the place of burning rather than on the altar. Okay, next topic. The Gemara continues its discussion of the sheep of Shavuos. When Rav Yitzchak came from the land of Israel, Eretz Yisrael, to Bavel, the Jewish community in Babylonia, which was part of Persia, He reported traditions that he learned in Eretz Yisrael, and he taught a baraisa with regard to a case of the 2 sheep of Shavuos, where one slaughtered them not in accordance with their mitzvah. For example, he slaughtered them for the sake of a different offering. He just had in mind the wrong kind of offering. He thought he was just slaughtering some person's sin offering. It turns out that he was slaughtering the sheep of Shavuos, right? So he had the wrong intention in mind. So with regard to a case of the 2 sheep of Shavuos, where one slaughtered them not in accordance with their mitzvah, for example, he slaughtered them for the sake of a different offering, so they are disqualified. And in that situation, they should be left overnight until their form decays and they attain the status of leftover sacrificial meat, and then they are brought out to the place designated for burning. Now, this is the way it's expressed, their form decays, but it's not like you leave them out until they rot, for a week or 10 days or a month, whatever. It's just once the deadline has passed, either a night and a day or 2 days and a night, depending on the kind of offering, the deadline is passed, that's considered that their form decay. Beyond that, depending on the kind of offering, it can't go on the altar, it can't be eaten by priests, it can't be eaten by the owner, it has to go to the place of burning. So once you leave it that long, it's going to the place of burning. Now Rav Nachman said to Rav Yitzchak, the master, meaning Rav Yitzchak, who compares the sheep of Shavuos to a sin offering, because they are juxtaposed in a verse, teaches the sheep are disqualified, like a sin offering that was slaughtered not for its own sake. By contrast, the Tana of the school of Levi, who derives the law with regard to an obligatory peace offering, for example, the 2 sheep of Shavuos, from the law of a voluntary peace offering, which is like the peace offering of an individual, and teaches that the 2 sheep remain valid offerings, just as a voluntary peace offering remains valid, even if it is slaughtered for the sake of a different offering. Right? So remember, at the beginning of Tractate Zevachim, we learned that with offerings of lesser sanctity, if you slaughtered it not for the sake of the correct offering, okay, so then if the owner had vowed to bring a peace offering, for example, or a gift offering, and the priest had in mind the wrong offering when he slaughtered it, okay, so that owner has not fulfilled his obligation, but this animal, can complete its journey to the altar, the blood can be sprinkled, and at least it didn't go to waste in that sense. An offering was made, a gift was made to the Lord. But a sin offering, if one slaughtered it not for its own sake, fully disqualified, end of story. Not only does the owner not fulfill his obligation to bring a sin offering, but it can't even be rendered some other offering, a peace offering. It's just fully disqualified. We don't sprinkle its blood, and it has to go to the place of burning. So, what are we going to say about the obligatory peace offering of Shavuos, which is a communal offering? If somebody slaughtered it not for its own sake, are we going to compare that to an offering of the highest sanctity, slaughtered not for its own sake, like a sin offering, so fully disqualified? Or are we going to say it's like peace offerings, which are offerings of lesser sanctity, and if the priests had in mind the wrong kind of offering, we can still at least offer it as a peace offering, even though it doesn't fulfill the obligation of Shavuos. As Levi teaches, and with regard to other peace offerings, like the peace offerings of a Nazir, that one slaughtered not in accordance with their mitzvah, they are valid offerings, like voluntary peace offerings, but they do not satisfy the obligation of the owner to bring the required peace offerings of a Nazir. One who takes a vow of Nazirus, when he completes that period of abstaining from products of the grapevine and cutting his hair and becoming impure for the dead, at the end of that period, he has to bring certain offerings. One of them is a peace offering. So it's obligatory for his situation. And if it was slaughtered not for its sake, it still is a peace offering that can be brought, but the Nazir himself has to bring another peace offering before he is going to be able to exit his Nazirs. And these offerings, right, these peace offerings, are eaten for only 1 day and 1 night, in accordance with the law concerning the peace offering of a Nazir, which is like a sin offering, as opposed to the 2 days and 1 night of voluntary peace offerings. They require neither bread nor the foreleg, unlike the required peace offering of a Nazir. Right? The required peace offering of a Nazir has certain stringencies that voluntary peace offerings don't have. If it was brought for the wrong reason, we're going to allow it to proceed as a voluntary peace offering, but we're going to still observe the stringencies of the peace offering of Nazir, even though it won't fulfill the obligation of this former Nazir. Now, the Gemara raised an objection to the opinion of Rav Yitzchak from that which was taught in the Baraisa, in a case where one is obligated to bring a guilt offering. And one is obligated to sacrifice as a guilt offering an animal in its first year, which the Torah calls a lamb, and we'll just define right here. When the Torah speaks about a lamb as opposed to a ram, right? So a ram is a male sheep. A lamb obviously could be male or female, but when we're talking about a lamb in this situation, we're talking about a male sheep that is less than 1 year old. And a ram is more than a year old, actually more than a year, older than a year and 1 month, right? So as long as it's a year and within the first month but hasn't completed 1 more month, it's considered a lamb. The difference between a lamb and a ram is only the age of the animal. Okay, so in a case where one is obligated to sacrifice as a guilt offering an animal in its first year, which the Torah calls a lamb, and instead he brought an animal in its second year, which is considered a ram. Or if he is obligated to sacrifice as a guilt offering an animal in its second year, and he brought an animal in its first year. So the offerings are disqualified. So depending on the type of guilt offering and the situation you're bringing it, you might either need a lamb or a ram. And if in a situation where you need a ram, you bring a lamb, or vice versa, it's disqualified. The offerings are disqualified. And what happens if they're disqualified? They are left overnight until their form decays, i.e. beyond their deadline. And then, instead of being brought to the altar, they're disposed of in the place of burning in the courtyard of the Holy Temple. But in the case of the burnt offering of a Nazir, i.e. the lamb that is sacrificed when he completes his Naziris, or the burnt offering of a woman after childbirth, again, situations where there's a obligatory offering that needs to be brought, i.e. the lamb that she sacrifices on the 41st day after giving birth to a son, or the 81st day after giving birth to a daughter, or the burnt offering of a mitzorah, i.e. the lamb that is sacrificed after he goes through his purification, after he's healed of his tsuras. In all of these cases, if the animals were in their second year instead and one slaughtered them, the offerings are valid. Okay, so we're seeing that there's a difference depending on the situation. In one situation, guilt offering, lamb versus ram, if you got the wrong one, disqualified. But in these other situations, burnt offerings of a Nazir, a woman after childbirth, or a mitzorah, if you switch the 1 year, the lamb versus ram, you make that mistake, it's not disqualified, okay? So the Baraisa concludes, and the principle of the matter is, why, if you have ram where you should have a lamb, it's disqualified for a guilt offering, but not for a burnt offering. Why? Any animal that is valid as a voluntary burnt offering is also valid as an obligatory burnt offering. And any animal that is disqualified as a sin offering is also disqualified as a guilt offering, except for an offering that was sacrificed not for its own sake, which is disqualified in the case of a sin offering, but not a guilt offering, right? Which we learned at the beginning of Tractate Zevachim. A sin offering that was slaughtered with the wrong intention at the time of its slaughter, disqualified. But a guilt offering, no. The guilt offering was slaughtered, and the priest had in mind a different offering or a different owner. The owner won't fulfill his obligation, but that offering can have its blood sprinkled on the altar and finish its journey to the altar as a peace offering. So this demonstrates that the laws of obligatory burnt offerings are derived from those of voluntary burnt offerings, despite the fact that the burnt offering of a Nazir is juxtaposed to the sin offering of a Nazir, and the burnt offering of a mitzorah is juxtaposed to the sin offering of a mitzorah. And similarly, the law pertaining to the sheep of Shavuos, which are obligatory peace offerings, should be derived from the law pertaining to the voluntary peace offerings. and not from the law pertaining to the sin offering, as Rav Yitzchak holds. Right? This is all a long, complex proof to tell you we should look to this related law in order to understand how we handle an error that was made, and not that area of the law. Okay, that's basically what we've done so far. So the Gemara answers, this Tana, who taught this Baraisa, is the Tana the school of Levi cited earlier, who holds that if one slaughters a sheep of Shavuos not for its own sake, it is nevertheless valid. Now the Gemara discusses the opinion of Rav Nachman, who maintains that the Tana the school of Levi holds that a sheep of Shavuos that was slaughtered not for its own sake is valid because he derives its law from that of a voluntary peace offering. So come in here what Levi teaches to the contrary. As Levi teaches, the guilt offering of a Nazir, i.e. the lamb he brings on the 8th day after becoming impure through contact with a corpse, which would violate his Naziris, he's got to bring an offering and then start over his count of days. And the guilt offering of a Metzora, i.e. the lamb that he brings at the completion of his purification, that one slaughtered not for their sake, are valid, but they did not satisfy the obligation of the owner. If one slaughtered them when the time had not yet arrived for their owners to sacrifice these offerings, or they were in their second year instead of their first year, and one slaughtered them, disqualified. So the Gemara comments, but if it is so that Levi derives the law of an obligatory offering from those of a voluntary one, as you just claimed, let him derive the law of the guilt offering from that of the peace offering, in which case the guilt offerings should be valid even if they were in their second year. And the Gemara answers, Levi derives the law concerning obligatory peace offerings from the law of voluntary peace offering. But he does not derive the law of guilt offerings from the law concerning a peace offering. Why would you make that inference? He just says, okay, the law of voluntary peace offerings is like the law of obligatory peace offerings. He's not going to now bridge peace offerings and guilt offerings. So the Gemara further challenges the statement of Rav Nachman. But if Levi derives the law of an obligatory peace offering from the law of a voluntary peace offering, let him similarly derive the law of one guilt offering from that of another guilt offering. He should derive that the guilt offering of a Nazir and the guilt offering of a Mitzvah are valid, even if the animal is in its second year, from the law concerning a guilt offering for robbery and a guilt offering for misuse of consecrated property, which are supposed to be a ram in its second year. Or if one brought a lamb in its first year as a guilt offering for robbery or a guilt offering for misuse of consecrated property, Levi should derive that it is valid from the law concerning the guilt offering of a Nazir and the guilt offering of a Mitzvah, which are lambs in their first year. Why doesn't he do that? So Rav Shimi Barashi said one can derive the law with regard to an item that is prepared not in its valid manner. For example, the sheep of Shavuos that were slaughtered not for their own sake, from the law with regard to another item that is prepared not in its valid manner. For example, a voluntary peace offering that was slaughtered not for its own sake. But one cannot derive the law with regard to an item that is prepared not in its valid manner. For example, the guilt offering of a Nazir or a Mitzorah that is sacrificed when it is in its second year, from the law with regard to an item that is prepared in its valid manner. For example, a guilt offering for robbery or for misuse of consecrated property that is sacrificed when it is in its second year. Right? What kind of logical leap are you going to make when you have a problem that is not addressed specifically in the written Torah? Right? You have to look to a neighboring law. So are you going to look at one that's more similar in its error or more similar when it's done correctly? So the Gemara asks, and one cannot derive the law with regard to disqualified offerings from the law with regard to fit offering? And question, is it true that one cannot derive the law with regard to disqualified offerings from the law with regard to fit offerings? Why can't we do that? Isn't it taught in a baraisa? From where is it derived with regard to an item that left the temple courtyard and was thereby disqualified? That if it nevertheless ascended upon the altar, it shall not descend. That was a surprise, right? Because the tzitz of the high priest atones for what? A mistake when the blood of an offering that became tamei, became impure, which should have been disqualified and not brought on the altar, and it was brought up anyway. Okay, the front plate of the high priest atones for that and renders it fit. But if an offering became disqualified because between the slaughter and the sprinkling of the blood on the altar, that flesh of that animal left the temple courtyard, that's a different kind of disqualification. The front plate doesn't atone for that. So if it is now nevertheless brought onto the altar, why is it that we leave it there? Why don't we say, no, you can't do that. Okay, you walked it up and now we're going to walk it back. But we don't. Why? But isn't it Tana Baraisa? From where is it derived with regard to an item that left the temple courtyard and was thereby disqualified, that if it nevertheless ascended upon the altar, it shall not descend? How do we know this? It is derived from the fact that an item that left the courtyard is valid for sacrifice on a private altar. Right? During those few short, brief periods in Jewish history when private altars were permitted, so this sacrifice, that left the temple courtyard, the public national altar, it would have been fit, had it been in one of those periods of history, to be sacrificed on a private altar. There was nothing else wrong with it other than leaving the courtyard. So here the Baraisa derives the law with regard to a disqualified offering from the law with regard to a fit offering. And so the Gemara answers at the top of page 49a, the Tana of that Baraisa relies on the phrase, this is the law of the burnt offering, ha'ola, the burnt offering. It is that which goes up on its firewood upon the altar all night unto the morning, from Leviticus 6:2. And this seemingly superfluous general phrase is interpreted homiletically to include the law that any item that ascends, ola, upon the altar shall not descend from it, even if it was disqualified. And the verse is the actual source for the law of the Baraisa, whereas the case of a private altar is not the source, it is cited merely in support of this ruling. So accordingly, the Baraisa does not contradict the opinion of Rav Shimi bar Ashi. So now the Gemara cites another discussion concerning the sheep of Shavuos. Rav Bar Chana taught a Baraisa before Rav. In a case of the two sheep of Shavuos, where one slaughtered them for the sake of rams and not for their own sake, they are valid offerings, but they do not satisfy the obligation of the owner, i.e. the community, to sacrifice these offerings, right? So we're back to this, the two sheep of Shavuos. Yeah, this is a mistake that is probably not going to be made, right? Because on Shavuos, the whole nation is watching. The priests are doing a very important public ceremony. They're unlikely to, just space and sacrifice the sheep of Shavuos with the whole nation watching and thinking, I'm slaughtering this sheep for an offering, that Jim brought, my buddy Jim. They're probably not going to make this mistake. But if they made that mistake, then what? Right? So because it is a peace offering, even though it's an obligatory communal peace offering, it's a peace offering. And so as a peace offering, if he had in mind the wrong offering and the wrong owner, it's a peace offering, so it can finish its journey to the altar as a peace offering, but the community, right, the nation of Israel, has not satisfied its obligation to bring the two sheep and the two loaves of Shavuos. They're going to have to start that process over again. Okay, we've seen that before today. So Rav Bar Chana taught a Baraisa before Rav. In the case of two sheep of Shavuos, where one slaughtered them for the sake of rams and not for their own sake, right, had in mind, in this case, not had in mind some other owner, some other offering, but he thought that these were rams when in fact they're lambs, right? He's supposed to bring a lamb with Shavuos, the lambs of Shavuos, and he's thinking that what he's slaughtering is a ram, right? So they are valid offerings, but they do not satisfy the obligation of the owner, i.e. the community, to sacrifice these offerings. And Rav said to Rav Bar Chana, that is not so. Rather, sheep certainly satisfy the obligation of the community. In other words, what he slaughtered was a lamb. What he's obligated to slaughter is a lamb. He did space, and he thought he was sacrificing a ram, right, which would be a sheep needed for some other offering. But the only, mistaken intention was that he thought what was in his hand was a ram. Now, if he actually sacrificed a ram, then the community did not fulfill its obligation of Shavuos. But what the community needed to sacrifice was a lamb, and what he did sacrifice was a lamb. He just thought he was sacrificing a ram. right? It's sort of like somebody believes they're committing a crime when in fact they're saving the community from a crime. Okay, so, he, as far as the community is concerned, he did the right thing. He had the wrong intention, but he ended up doing the right thing. So that's why Rav says, well, the community got what it needed. Okay, he thought he was slaughtering a ram, but he did in fact slaughter a lamb, and we need him to slaughter a lamb. So why shouldn't the community have its benefit that it was, needing and entitled to? Rav Chisda said, the statement of Rav is reasonable in a case where one thought that they were rams when he slaughtered them, and nevertheless slaughtered them for the sake of lambs. In such a case, it makes sense that they satisfy the community's obligation since the lambs were slaughtered for the sake of lambs. So interesting. This is where I guess the priest thought, oh man, I messed up. Everybody's watching. I needed to bring a lamb and I brought a ram by mistake. I'm not going to say anything. I'm just going to keep going. But what he had in his hand was a lamb. He didn't make a mistake. He just thought he was making a mistake. So it's in that situation, says Rav Chisda, that the community's obligation is fulfilled because what he was slaughtering them for is lambs. They were lambs. He just thought they were rams. But in a case where he thought that they were rams when he slaughtered them, and he therefore slaughtered them for the sake of rams, he thought it was a ram, and he thought he was slaughtering it for the sake of Jim's obligation, not the Shavuos lambs, then it does not satisfy the community's obligation, even though they were actually lambs. And this is due to the fact that the erroneous uprooting of the status of an offering constitutes uprooting, despite the fact that it was done in error. But Rabbah said the erroneous uprooting of the status of an offering does not constitute uprooting, right? He needed to bring a lamb, and he brought a lamb. So the fact that he thought he was holding a ram, whether he was doing it for the sake of a ram or not for the sake of a ram, since he slaughtered a lamb when he needed to slaughter a lamb, the fact that he had some mistaken intention is not going to uproot the propriety of that offering because the community needed a lamb and he slaughtered a lamb. Whatever he had in mind, but that was a mistake, doesn't matter in this situation. Rava said, we raise an objection to our own ruling. See how careful the sages are to get the law right, even when it contradicts themselves. We raise an objection to our own ruling concerning this law from that which was taught in a Mishna, tractate Gittin. In a case of priests who disqualified an offering through improper intention in the temple, by expressing, while sacrificing the offering, the intention to eat it after the appropriate time, if they did so intentionally, they are liable to pay the value of the offering to its owner, who must now bring another offering. It follows, therefore, that if the priest did so unintentionally, they are exempt. So this question came up often when we were in Zevachim and we didn't have the answer in front of us. And here it is. Right? What happens if the priest messes up? And like a poor person saved up all year to bring that animal offering that he wanted to bring or needed to bring, and then the priest messed it up, right? Well, if the priest messed it up intentionally, he has to pay for the replacement animal. But if the priest did it unintentionally, he doesn't. Now, we don't know if there was some fund in the temple to help poor people out in this kind of situation, but now we know the answer, at least with respect to the priest's point of view. And it is taught concerning this case in a Baraisa. Even though they slaughtered it with improper intent unintentionally, their act of improper intention renders the offering pigul, despite the fact that they are exempt from paying damages. What are the circumstances in which this is the law? Remember, pigul is if they had an intent to eat it beyond its time, that's going to disqualify it even at the time, from the time of slaughter. What are the circumstances of this law if we say that it is referring to a case where the priest knew that the offering was a sin offering, which is eaten for only 1 day and 1 night, and nevertheless he intended the offering to be for the sake of a peace offering, which is eaten for 2 days and 1 night, and thereby his intention was that it be eaten after its appropriate time? Is this considered an unintentional act by the priests? Certainly they were acting intentionally, not to ruin the offering for the person bringing it, but he was intentionally, mischaracterizing it as the wrong kind of offering. it was a mistake, but there was an act of intentionality. So rather, is it not referring to a case where the offering was a sin offering, which is eaten for only 1 day and 1 night, and the priest thought it was a peace offering, and therefore he intended the offering to be for the sake of a peace offering, which is eaten for 2 days and 1 night, and thereby his intention was that it be eaten after its appropriate time. And with regard to this case, the Tana taught, their act of improper intention renders the offering pigul, because he thought he could eat it beyond what was its actual deadline. So apparently this proves that the erroneous uprooting of the status of an offering does constitute uprooting, contrary to the ruling of Rabbah. Abaye said to Rava, there is no objection from this baraisa, because actually it is referring to a case where the priest knew that it was a sin offering, and nevertheless he intended the offering to be for the sake of a peace offering, and his uprooting was done intentionally. Here it really was intention. Nevertheless, the baraisa refers to the priest as acting unintentionally, because it's referring to circumstances where the priest says, i.e. he mistakenly thinks that it is permitted to sacrifice the offering with this intent, right? He did it intentionally, but he thought it was permitted. His mistake is not what kind of offering he was bringing. The mistake that he made was that he thought that he understood the law wrong, right? He made a mistake with what is the law. Rabbi Zera raises an objection to Rabbah's opinion that erroneous uprooting of the status of an offering does not constitute uprooting. A baraisa, right? Basically, in some situations, having the wrong intent, even though you did it right, is going to disqualify the whole thing, and in other situations, it's not. So let's work with that. Okay. So Rabbi Zera raised an objection to Rabbah's opinion that erroneous uprooting of the status of an offering does not constitute uprooting. A baraisa teaches that Rabbi Shimon says, all meal offerings from which the handful was removed, not for their sake, are entirely valid and have even satisfied the obligation of the owner, unlike animal offerings that are slaughtered not for their sake, which do not satisfy the obligation of the owner. Why? This is because meal offerings are not similar to animal offerings, as in the case of one who removes a handful from a meal offering prepared in a shallow pan for the sake of a meal offering prepared in a deep pan, different kinds of meal offerings. Its mode of preparation proves that it is a shallow pan meal offering and not a deep pan meal offering. And since a meal offering prepared in a shallow pan is hard and one prepared in a deep pan is soft, his intention is plainly mistaken. Similarly, if one removes a handful from a dry meal offering, the meal offering of a sinner, which has no oil, for the sake of a meal offering mixed with oil, his intention is plainly mistaken, as its mode of preparation proves that it is a dry meal offering. Whereas with animal offerings, right, you can't tell just by looking at the animal what kind of offering it is, unlike meal offerings. But with regard to animal offerings, this is not so. There's one mode of slaughter for all of the offerings, one mode of collection of the blood for all of them, and one mode of sprinkling for all of them. That's why the mental state of the priest is so important for animal offerings. With meal offerings, you can tell what kind of offering he's bringing just by looking at it. With an animal, you can't. That's why you have to trust that the priest has the correct mental state. Since the only factor that distinguishes between one type of offering and another is the intention of the individuals involved in its sacrifice, the intention is significant. Consequently, if one of the sacrificial rites is performed for the sake of the wrong type of offering, the offering does not satisfy its owner's obligation. And the Gemara clarifies what are the circumstances to which Rabbi Shimon is referring if we say that he's referring to a case where the priest knew that the meal offering was prepared in a shallow pan, and nevertheless he removed a handful from it for the sake of a meal offering prepared in a deep pan. Then although its mode of preparation proves that it was prepared in a shallow pan, so what? In any case, he is consciously uprooting its status as a shallow pan meal offering and changing it to a deep pan meal offering by means of his intention when he removes the handful. I'm almost done. Questions or comments, please get them in now. So rather, is it not referring to a case where the priest thought it was a meal offering prepared in a deep pan, and therefore removed a handful for the sake of a meal offering prepared in a deep pan. But he was mistaken, as it was actually a meal offering prepared in a shallow pan. And it is specifically here, in this case, that Rabbi Shimon rules that the offering remains valid, since its mode of preparation proves that it is a shallow pan meal offering, which indicates that in general, erroneous uprooting of the status of an offering does constitute uprooting, contrary to the ruling of Rabbah. And Abaye said to Rabbi Zera in response to his objection, this objection to Rabbah's opinion is inconclusive, because one can explain that the Baraisa is actually referring to a case where the priest knew that the meal offering was prepared in a shallow pan, and nevertheless he removed a handful for the sake of a meal offering prepared in a deep pan. And with regard to that which you said in your question, although its mode of preparation proves that it is prepared in a shallow pan, what of it? I.e., since he is consciously uprooting its identity, how can it satisfy its owner's obligation? To this, Abaye answers that Rabbah conforms to his own line of reasoning. As Rabbah says, the merciful one disqualifies an offering due to improper intent that is not recognizably false, i.e., when the physical properties of the offering itself do not prove that the intent is mistaken. But the merciful one does not disqualify an offering due to improper intent that is obviously mistaken. Consequently, if one removes a handful from a shallow pan meal offering for the sake of a deep pan meal offering, even if he did so consciously, the offering remains valid and satisfies the owner's obligation. And with that, we conclude Mishnah number 4. Here in chapter 4 of tractate Menachot. We're going to pick it up with Mishnah number 5. Had the wrong label there. Mishnah number 5. As I mentioned at the top of the hour, I have a plane ticket to go back to America tomorrow. So assuming all goes well, we will not have class tomorrow, Monday, because I'll be on a plane. And then we'll be back to our normal time of 6 p.m. Pacific on Tuesday and Wednesday. But if the war interferes with my plans and El Al's plans, then we may have to shift the schedule. So check the Facebook page, Accidental Talmudist, tomorrow. As I said, if all sticks with the plan, no class tomorrow, class back to our regular time, Tuesday and Wednesday. I'm going to take a couple of comments. I do want to just mention that I earlier today made a siyum on tractate Megillah, which I was reading with some friends to prepare for Purim in LA in our community. They ended up finishing it together and making the hadran, the little ceremony at the completion of a tractate. At the Purim meal, I wasn't able to join them, so I did that myself today, earlier. But I just wanted to share with you something that occurs near the end of Tractate Megillah, which is just so relevant to what we're talking about here, right? We're really, these are complex, very complex laws of offerings that we've been discussing, and they're not easy. So why are we doing this? Why are we struggling like this? And so I just wanted to read to you this very little teaching that occurs near the end of Tractate Megillah that like I said, I read it today and I think is really relevant to what we're doing here, right? So Abraham said to God, right? And this is a conversation in which God says to Abraham, I love you so much. Your progeny are going to be blessed. I'm always going to have a relationship with them. The children of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the Jews, I'm always going to have a relationship with them. And so Abraham asked God, well, by what shall I know this? How do I know that this is so? Very chutzpahdik thing for Abraham to say to God after God says to him, I'm going to have a relationship with your progeny. You don't take God's word for it? Abraham says, by what shall I know this? God said to him, take from me a heifer of 3 years old, Genesis 15:9. And with this, God intimated to Abraham that even if his descendants will sin, they will be able to achieve atonement through sacrificing offerings. Right? So Abraham was saying, well, what if my descendants behave badly? Will you still have a relationship with them? And God says to him, listen, if your descendants behave badly, they'll be able to atone for their sins by bringing offerings. Abraham said to God, Master of the universe, this works out well when the temple is standing, and offerings can be brought to achieve atonement. But when the temple will no longer be standing, then what will become of my descendants? And God said to Abraham, I have already established for them the order of offerings, i.e. the verses of the Torah pertaining to the laws of the offerings. And whenever they read those portions, i.e. study these laws of the offerings, I will deem it as if they were sacrificing offerings before me, and I will pardon them for their iniquities. Right? So this study that we're engaging in together, difficult and challenging as it is achieving some atonement for all the sins of the Jewish people. It's a beautiful thing that we're doing, wonderful work that we're doing. Okay, just a couple of comments from Tom. Is there a halachic difference between sinning, technically, for a gain, as opposed to sinning technically to avoid a loss? It's a great question. I mean, again, we're saying technically, like, they're saying, redesignated an offering that was going to go along one channel and changing it into a different kind of offering, somewhat unauthorized, in order that an animal that was sacrificed doesn't end up being wasted, right? But, we're not going to create a situation where somebody can steal something and keep it, right? It's not that kind of sinning for gain. But I think sinning to avoid a loss, something somewhat improper to avoid a loss, is definitely considered less harmful than for a gain. Right? So, for example, during Chol HaMoed, we're not really supposed to do work during the intermediate days of a festival, but it's considered somewhat allowable just to avoid a loss, right? You can't be entering into and negotiating and creating new business deals during Chol HaMoed, but it's not so bad if you just do something to prevent a loss. And Tom also says, what if you bring the ram instead of the lamb, and it is burned, blood sprinkled, etc., so there's no remains to leave overnight, and then take to the place of burning? In other words, you don't notice that you've made this mistake until too late, right? I think in that situation, there's no lamb to dispose of if you took it up as a burnt offering, but you'll just recognize that the obligation of the owner was not fulfilled. That's my sense of it. And finally, Guy, thank you, Sal and Nina. You've inspired me to get out some shallow pans and bake a cake. Sudden sweet tooth. I'm talking about the meal offerings and the shallow and deep pans, which are different types of offerings. That's what I've got for us today. And with God's help, we'll be together again Tuesday, not tomorrow. Please, God, I should get out. I hate to leave the land of Israel, but at this point, I've been blessed to spend an extra 9 days here. So hopefully the plane goes as scheduled and we're back to our regular schedule Tuesday and Wednesday. Later in the week, there may be some adjustment because we have a film playing in a film festival, but we'll deal with that then. So as of now, if my plane goes out tomorrow, no class Monday, back to our regular time, 6 p.m. Pacific, Tuesday and Wednesday. All the best, my holy sisters and brothers. Be well, be good, be safe. Take care.